So basically, I posed three questions for myself over the years. What is the relationship between humanity and the natural world? And do humans have a special responsibility vis-a-vis other creatures, the rest of the world? And is human destiny somehow entwined with the natural world? And these are the same three questions that the great faith traditions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, have asked for centuries. What is the meaning of life? What is the place of humans in creation? And what is the role or the destiny of humanity within the context of all creation? So basically, the questions that the environmental movement poses, I would submit this morning, are fundamentally religious questions. And I'd like to make that point, if I could, in the next little while. And see if you agree, and see what discussion that may elicit. So what I would like to propose is that to respond to this Herculean of tasks, the environmental crisis, however term we want to give to it, I think that religious discourse, a value-laden language, is a very important way to proceed, as well as everything else, but it's fundamentally important. And I'd like to, this is the thesis I want to propose, and I'd like to say that in our present environmental discourse, the language that takes dominance is a strong technical language. It's science-based, a legal language, legislatively based, and these discourses, this type of language, is very, very important. But I'd like to say as well that religious language is also should be part of the package. And then at the end of the talk, I'd like to provide what form this language may take, at least from a Christian context, and that's the context that I'll have to speak from this morning. What type of language, and I'm going to call it the spirituality of nature, and just to provide that context. And okay, so that's my hope for this morning. So basically, the great hopes that we have for the world, and we'll express it in different terms. We use different terms today, like ecosystem integrity, sustainable forestry, biodiversity, emulation of natural disturbance, forest health from a forest context, and on and on. And we'll use these quasi-scientific terms to help us to understand where we're trying to move toward. But I think that often our conversation gets reduced to the technical, scientific, legal, or legislative language, and that there's a fundamental language, though, that grounds and supports all these other languages that also I think we would need to address. I was just reading the Western Star a few days ago, and Dr. Mo Nazir and Mr. Matt Churchill in the Cornerbrook Pulp and Paper make the point quite strong that we need science as the basis of our forest management. That only with good and proper science can we make good and proper decisions. And I would respectfully submit that this is a real misunderstanding of how we make decisions in resource allocation. That ultimately all resource conflicts are ultimately political in nature. In other words, they're a conflict between human values, and it gets worked out then at the political level. Yet, resource managers and the people in the political sphere will often try to reduce this language, reduce this concern, this conflict among values, to a technical language, because that's often the only language that they can use and are informed about. So resource managers, when confronted with social value conflict, will reduce the conflict to technical language. I'd just like to make a few points on that. I remember last year in the, was it last summer or summer before, the Upper Humber project, when they tried to, Cornerbrook Pulp and Paper, tried to dam the Upper Humber. And I was at a number of the meetings given by Deer Lake Power Company. And it was quite interesting to see that the only language that was dominant in the entire meeting, there were a lot of wonderful charts and descriptions, and all the engineers and technical people were there. So that was the language that dominated the discussion, the conflict. Flow rates, did it have any effect on salmon? How far up did salmon migrate? Volume, rates, siltation concerns. And these are all obviously very, very important things that we have to consider. But there was no consideration, at least not in that level, of even the question of should we even dam this river? Or asking the more radical question of who will benefit from this dam. And should, for example, should a private company have the right, based on a decades-old right to the water rights, should they have the right to dam a very important river that's a natural icon for people in Newfoundland? And that basically is, I would submit, is a religious question. Because you're asking what role or what influence or how do I relate to this river as a human being, as a society, as a culture. But the language, though, wasn't allowed to enter that sphere because you always gets pushed back to, well, will the dam have any effect on siltation rates? Will the dam have any effect on water flow? And then you're reduced then to a technical conflict. And then it becomes a conflict of experts. And everybody else gets pushed to the side. Whereas the more fundamental questions are really value-laden questions and religious questions. Science cannot tell us where to go, cannot tell us what to do. It just tells us what is. And it just tells us what is based on the best available knowledge we have right now. So science is not prescriptive, science is only descriptive. It's not normative, whereas religious language tends to be normative. Science says, this is how this works. Whether it's genetically modified foods, hydroelectric dams, clear-cut logging in old-growth forests, science can give us a possible direction, a possible sense of what is happening. Only value-laden language, i.e. religious language, can tell us, do we want to do it? The Human Genome Project. Science will determine within a number of years the entire genetic makeup of the human person. And we will have a good grasp of how we're made up genetically. The other question to ask, do we want to do it? What implication will it have? What are the moral implications? And on and on and on. So there's two different types of languages on the go that are at conflict even with each other. So science-laden language is different from value-laden language. And interestingly enough, the terms we use now in our conversation, especially like in forestry, biodiversity, ecological integrity, we hear that term quite a lot from Grossmoor National Park, forest health, they're quasi-scientific terms. They're not true scientific terms because they express in some way a real concern about the diversity of life on the planet, about our ecosystems and how we relate to these ecosystems. So they become, in a sense, bridge concepts between science and value, between science and human value. And so we brought two of these conversations together in these terms. And that's why the terms are so difficult to get a handle on. That's why there's so much argument over what is sustainable forestry. There's so much debate about what is biological diversity and how do we manage for it. And, or ecological, what do you mean by ecological integrity of Grossmoor National Park? It's really hard to put a scientific label to it because it's really value-laden. It comes out of an ultimate concern that we have for these ecosystems. So basically, we're moving always toward religious language, and yet we're often unable or unwilling to articulate the religious language. Maybe because of the bias or the consideration that religious language really won't fulfill the day. We got to stick to the facts. But people don't live by facts. We don't choose who we're going to marry or live with because of facts. We don't choose how many children we're going to have with just simple scientific facts. For example, our human health is not determined totally on scientific values or facts. Human health deals holistically with deals with many life decisions that we make that are not affected necessarily by science, by health science. And the same thing with forest health or ecosystem integrity. So that's the kind of the thesis that I want to propose. There is no doubt that faith and ecology are two friends that have yet to meet. Personally, I've experienced this quite well. And I live at the Cathedral Parish in Conabrook, and many of the parishioners will phone up and ask, what's Father John doing in the woods? Is he a real priest? You know, and is he cutting wood for Kronenberg Pulp and Paper, trying to make a bit of extra money for the parish? Especially given the present lawsuit against the St. George Diocese, but that's another thing altogether.
John, you're double dipping, John.
Double dipping, just right. Yeah, I'm really moonlighting. I remember the former head of the UBC Forest Sciences Department, Dr. Jean Nam-Koon, from South Korea, and Jean said to me one day, he said, you know, what does Christianity have concern itself with the natural world for? And you know, because from his point of view, Christianity dealt with the human person only, and even then just the human soul, whatever he meant by that. And he says, what is the, you know, because for a long time, I think in the popular imagination, Christianity is concerned only with the drama between God, between the divine and humans. And nature is somehow the backdrop or the stage upon which all this divine drama gets played out. Some kind of Shakespearean feat. And so it's a very important question from Jean. You know, why does Christianity concern itself with the natural world when all, from his perspective, as a non-Christian from South Korea, the only thing that he saw Christianity dealing with was the salvation of the human person, and even then the salvation of the human soul. And in our language too, in Christian language, my own faith tradition, one can understand this. You know, why worry about earth when we're all waiting to get into heaven? You know, why worry about the body when it's the soul that's most important? Why worry about nature when it's supernature that we're really concerned about? And why worry about the material when it's the spiritual that is of prime importance? And I would respectfully submit that this is a heresy, that in the authentic Christian tradition, all these come together. But maybe it hasn't been expressed well and hasn't been taught very well. There was a study done at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies in the early 1980s that looked at the correlation between those who attended faith services in all the different denominations and concern for nature. And they found a negative correlation, that those who attended church didn't have much to worry about nature, and vice versa. And there was an interesting study done, the profile of BC residents by the Globe and Mail in October 1997. Basically asked the question, who showed the greatest concern for nature in Canada? And this is the response they got. The people in Canada who show the greatest concern for the quality of the environment in BC were left of center, middle-aged women of European ethnic origin who don't go to church. So I'm sure there are no people here of that description, especially those who don't go to church. So that's where, that's certainly where we find ourselves, at least in sort of the popular conception of the popular mind. But as with everything, things are always a bit more complicated in most cases. So what I'd like to do now is just to get my time. Yeah, is just to try to address, well, what do I mean by a spirituality of nature, and is there anything that we can formulate and try to conceptualize or articulate that would be of aid in the environmental discourse? Because I firmly believe that the religious communities of Canada, North America, the world, of whatever tradition, Christian, non-Christian, have a great role to play in the environmental movement. I don't even know if it is a movement anymore, in the care for creation, care for the earth. I'll use that term. And there is a lot in the traditions that are very old, thousands of years old, and that have a lot to say. And I think it would be a grave error and a grave lacuna if the environmental movement did not somehow were able to tap this great source of vitality and great source of energy that is there. So what I'd like to provide now is, in my opinion, 4 characteristics of a spirituality of nature that is, and again, I come from a Christian perspective, a Catholic perspective, that's who I am.